All right, welcome everyone. In this video, what we're going to take a look at is a utility called DetectItEasy. And the reason that we're going to look at this is because it's a very common and popular utility for really analyzing sort of those next stage payloads. So in the last video, we looked at a form book dropper. So a .NET binary that dropped a native code PE file or executable. And so usually, as we kind of work our way through an attack chain, going from Office documents or phishing links or ISO files to LNK files to whatever the chain is, usually as we get towards the end of that, we tend to find these native code executables or .NET binaries or something that requires a slightly different set of tools and a little bit different understanding in order to really make that initial assessment. So DetectItEasy is one of those tools. I use it quite often for what I'm going to demonstrate today. Now, you can find DetectItEasy on its GitHub, detect-it-easy. You'll find it installed in a lot of popular VMs such as the Flare VM. You can use Choco if you are to install it, Choco install. It oftentimes goes by DIE or DIE, which is just the abbreviation for DetectItEasy. Okay, for our sample today, we'll be taking a look at this archive stealer or VDAR stealer. There's some discrepancy in the naming, and I think that'll actually play into this video and some of the following videos where we'll do a deeper investigation into this particular file, do some unpacking and some other really, kind of analysis of what's going on. So here you can see the hash. I'll make sure to get the hash into the video notes. Of course, if I forget, I'm very good at doing that. Please do remind me through the comments. Of course, platforms like this, you'll see me use these in a lot of videos. The malware bazaar from abuse.ch, these are very good platforms because if you're willing to upload a file, then it's publicly available, but you can get some of the signatures such as the major family name, as well as other tags, vendor threat intelligence, and quite a bit of information to help you determine what is this payload, what is this executable file that I'm analyzing, and that's really the main goal of our conversation today. Now, if you're not willing to upload it, that's also fine. You can search by hash, which is what I did. As you can see, the different hashes that are available here, and if it's available, you'll be able to get that same information without uploading the file yourself. If it's not available, well, then you're kind of out of luck unless you're willing to upload the file or look at the other sources of intelligence that are out there. And that's really not the point of the video to go through all of them. The most important here is that you'll have the access to the sample because it is publicly available on the Malware Bazaar. And it's also given us some initial insight into the type of file, the type of malware that we're dealing with. You can search for the hash on the URL house. Malware Bazaar is more about file artifacts. URL house is more about the URLs. So here you can see the two different URLs that were discovered distributing this particular file. Probably no surprise because both of these projects, the URL house and the Malware Bazaar, are ran by abuse.ch, that they would both tag them with the same family, which is archive stealer. Now, of course, VirusTotal is another very, very popular website for collecting information about, the things that we're investigating, the files, the IP addresses, domain names. So here, searching for the file hash, you'll get detections. This is really just a number of different antivirus vendors telling you what they think about the file. Anything that has a relatively high ratio here, 51 out of 72 is definitely, I would consider, high. I don't know if in the documentation or in the community at large there's a consensus on what constitutes that that line at which something becomes absolutely malicious. But usually with these the greater amount of detections, the better. If it's less than 10, I'm usually not too suspicious about something. VirusTotal does a good job of identifying known good too, and you'll see that here in the information that they provide. If it's, say, a known executable that's distributed with Microsoft Windows or something, because sometimes those get distributed as well as part of the toolkit that a malware threat actor will utilize. In any case, when we're looking at the detections, they don't necessarily tell us like the signatures that we saw previous. And that's one of the reasons that I particularly like Malware Bazaar URL house, is that they can give you a very concrete signature. You may see some discrepancies as we're seeing today, but sometimes that's because you have different what we see as different malware families that are really from code wise they're from a very similar background. So they share a lot of similarities, and so it's a little bit harder to differentiate between the two. This particular sample you might find, let's see here, we've got some VDAR, which is another stealer, and you'll see that used throughout some of these classifications. And so sometimes you can sort of eyeball these and go, oh, it looks like it's in this case a VDAR. It certainly seems like it's a stealer, because stealer or steal is a very common name. Now, VirusTotal also has a lot of additional information. For example, you have the details, which is the things like the file type, the hashes. And one thing I wanted to point out, kind of why I'm driving us here through this VirusTotal path, is that it also has now integrated DetectItEasy results. And so you'll see these results here, PE32 file type, and then some signatures that it's provided. And so you'll see these in the DetectItEasy utility here, the GUI, in just a moment, but it's now included in VirusTotal, which means you're also able to use this information to search through VirusTotal. And if you have a subscription to VirusTotal, use it for your retro hunts and your live hunts and other things. Now, there's other platforms, sandboxes such as Triage and AnyRun and Joe Sandbox and any number of these. These are also a good first stop, especially if the file has already been reported, because here you can see now that the Triage has classified this, labeled this as VDAR, and they also have a config extraction. So config meaning that this particular malware family has a configuration section. Usually that configuration section will have version information. It may have a botnet tag. It'll have command and control nodes. It might have different properties as to what to steal and how to behave. And so you can create these extractors that extract that information, as you see here. And when someone has a specific malware family extractor, that's a pretty good understanding of how that malware operates. And so my confidence in their ability to detect it and classify it, in this case as VDAR, becomes a lot higher. We have AnyRun. I don't have anything in particular here I wanted to pull up, but you certainly, there's any number of these. And video demonstrations like this, especially that are geared more towards, introducing a new tool and kind of the beginner sphere, I like to use multiple different tools, because you'll see not only the overlap in the information that they provide, but then also the differences, and where you'll start to develop I'm going to go to an instinct for, I'm going to use triage for this because I know I'm going to get config extraction, and AnyRun until recently didn't have config extraction, and now they're starting to build that support. So you'll develop sort of this knack for which platform you want to use. Let's move to DetectItEasy. That's the main discussion point here. Very easy. Once you launch, you have the GUI. You can just drag and drop any file. I've got a couple of different files here. You can see as we drag and drop those, it just quickly analyzes and starts to provide results. So let's stick with the main binary that we began analyzing, that I set the stage for there using those different OSINT tools. You have a lot of information sort of condensed or crammed into the UI. So I'll just hit some of the high points here. First is the file type. You see it's identified this as PE32. So one of the first steps in analyzing any sort of payload is to determine the file type. It's a .NET binary. I'm going to analyze it a little bit different. If it's an ELF file, a Linux executable, I'm going to analyze it quite a bit differently, right? So that's really important to identify that, as simple as it may sound. The entry point is also quite helpful. Now, most of the times, if we're going to continue the analysis, we're going to use a tool like, say, IDAPRO or Ghidra, or Binary Ninja. It will parse, those tools will parse that information utilizing the entry point, and really use it without us having to think much about it. But at this stage, when I'm doing this level of analysis, I do oftentimes like to take note of the entry point. What is it? Where is it? What section does it lie in? Whereabouts in the binary it is? And you'll see why that is in just a moment. You can start to do some disassembly, although I'm going to save all of the disassembly and the unpacking actually for the next video. So we'll get there. Base address, 400,000 hex. That's no surprise. Most of the PE files we'll deal with have this as the default address. That doesn't mean that they're always going to be loaded there. The operating system, if it's using address space layout randomization, it might provide a different address. But in this case, the image base, this is typically the default. We can look at a memory map. You can see different windows will pop up here, and this is showing us essentially, you've got the hex view down below, and then you've got the different sections and where those are going to be mapped into memory. Now, I have a video discussing the PE file and in disk, on disk versus in memory analysis. And if this is something that's new to you, then I would suggest that you go and check that out, because there is enough of a difference that it does affect your analysis, especially as you're getting more into doing reverse engineering and unpacking and extracting things from memory. So this is showing us the location of these different sections and kind of where they'll be at in memory, as well as the size. And the sections are going to typically contain some data, right? Text section is typically executable code. Our data is typically read-only data like constant values or globals. Data section can just contain data. You have resources, you have relocation information. They're different known sections that the PE file defines that the operating system will understand, as well as the program then as it begins to execute. So it's important to get a basic understanding about these sections. Sometimes different packers, and a packer is just simply a utility that takes an original program and essentially wraps itself around it and hides that inner program. And then during execution, it unravels that and executes it. Some packers can be really straightforward, like UPX, and that there is an executable that is wrapped inside another executable, and when it runs, it unpacks that inner executable, loads it into memory, and executes it. Some of them can get pretty complex, and it's a lot harder to differentiate between the unpacking process and the unpacked code or the unpacked executable. And sometimes those section names can be a big indication. We'll take a look at an example here today as well. We have, of course, basic information, file information. We have MIME type, which is just going to be essentially like the libmagic. What type of file am I dealing with? We have the different hashes. And not only do we have the overall hash of the file, but then we also have hashes of the different sections and some of the imports and things that, hashes that can be really helpful when you're trying to, pivot from one sample to find related samples. And it's often the case that during the packing process, that modifies itself, a little bit every time. And it can just be one bit or one byte that gets modified so that the hash is always different, but maybe it has the same imports. And so that import table can be hashed, and now that hash can help you to identify related samples. You have to be kind of wary of that process, because it can also capture essentially false positives. That is, it can capture other files that have that same hash, but they're not the actual same malware, right? So as you start to maybe loosen things up a little bit in terms of how you're trying to identify related samples, it can get a little bit trickier. You have strings. Strings are always important, and you can do things like, let's go back to triage. Triage is a sandbox. This thing was executed in a sandbox, which is likely, and you'll see through the next video or two, how it was able to get the C2 information. But we can see very clearly that the sandbox was able to extract this t.me URL in steamcommunity.com/profiles. But if we go back to the strings, and let's say we filter for t.me, it's not there. Steam, it's not there, right? And so that tells us, at least it tells me, that likely this is packed. This is obfuscated in a way that if we want to, get to a point where we understand where that information is, we've got to unravel this first stage. So there's our strings, and that can be insightful just to take a look at and understand. Hex editor, yeah, that's just the hex editor. And then we have our entropy. Now, the entropy can also be quite helpful. And what you're going to find is that you have this overall status where they overall measure the entropy. This is on a scale, as you see here, from 0 to 8, 8 being the highest amount of entropy, 0 being the least. And overall, this file has a high degree of entropy. So the tool has classified it as packed, even though we haven't quite gotten there, but down, you'll see in a minute, down in the signature section, there is no packer that's been determined. When we look at the kind of this view down below, you have a graph of the overall file entropy. So from offset 0 to the end of the file. And then we have the different sections. And these are, because some of these different areas of the file get a little hard to see, but they do get highlighted here down in the graph. So the PE header, yeah, that's kind of vital information that's needed to parse the file, load it into memory, and begin its execution. Probably not going to be packed. The text section. Okay, this one's kind of interesting because it has a very small text section, and you can see the overall entropy of it is very, very low. And that would make sense because, as I'm starting to try to determine what am I going to do next with this file, particularly if I'm interested in REing it, this tells me that likely the text section, because it is so small, and it's not a high degree of entropy, this is likely where the unpacking routine takes place. If we also note the entry point, let's close our entropy window, was 402851. That's likely in the text section. Let's go back to entropy. All right, so that would make sense that this file is going to be in execution. It's going to go into this small section, and that section is largely responsible for unpacking and then executing that next stage, that unpacked code and or executable. So that helps us to understand if we take this file now, we put it into IDAPRO and we disassemble it, we're probably just looking at unpacking logic, which we may or may not have to do. Okay, as you select these, you can see the graph here will start to persist how we're looking at the file. Let's just unhighlight those. Our data, read-only data, small section, but then as we move into the data section, you can see this is a rather large chunk of data, and it's almost, it's got a very high measure of entropy, 7.6. So I would suspect that this is actually our packed or obfuscated code, probably a PE file, but we'll find out when we unpack it, and this is where it's located. From there we have resource. There could be some interesting things in the resource file. It could just be junk and filler. We can take a look at it if we want to, if we need to, and then relocation information, very small section, probably not much of a factor at this point in our analysis. Okay, so that's what the entropy window looks like. We have quick links, VirusTotal. If we click that, of course, it'll open up a browser, search the hash for us. PE, let's see, what does that do? I didn't even click on that before I recorded this, so I suspect that it'll give us a breakdown of the PE file, which it does do to some degree here. We have the DOS header, the image NT headers, the file header, and this is all really helpful, especially if you're getting into more of the kind of the weeds of what's going on in the PE file itself, the PE file being the portable executable file. So here you can see we have also got our resource section, things like version information, not uncommon. Some oddly repeating patterns. I don't recognize those off the top of my head. It could be something important. It could be completely just kind of dumb luck. As you saw with the version info, it's got information like helper.exe and help system, and oftentimes you'll see this information included as another kind of means of obfuscation. It's there, it's constantly changing, so it's hard to use it as a solid indicator to detect related samples. It might make it look a little bit more like a legitimate file, so someone who's maybe got a little less experience has a hard time differentiating that because it maybe looks legitimate. So there's a number of reasons why you might find information like that there. Okay, normally at this point I'd say, does anyone have any questions? So if you do, please feel free to leave some comments in the video. I will do my best to answer those in a timely manner. But short of that, let's move on to probably the reason that a lot of folks use this, and that's for its ability to scan and apply signatures to try to help us determine things like packers. You'll see with this particular file, all we have for results is compiler linker. That's still helpful. And in this case, because it says, hey, it looks like this thing was compiled using Microsoft Visual C, C++, what that tells me is that I'm likely going to have code here that is, not only am I going to have code here that is of course written by whoever created the packer, who created this malware, but I'm also going to have compiler generated code from Microsoft. And so I want to make sure that if I get to the point where I'm debugging or I'm looking at this in IDA or Ghidra or whatever, that I recognize that and I make sure that I start not in the compiler generated code, things like initializing stack cookies and initializing the C runtime, but I get to the point where there's actual that custom logic. And we'll talk about that in the next video if you're not 100% sure what I'm talking about. Now, some samples I've looked at recently, they were assembled using an assembler like MASM or FASM. And so that to me indicates that pretty much everything I'm looking at is going to be was probably custom written in some sort of a either directly or maybe some toolkit that the authors were using. But I'm probably going to find less of that compiler generated stuff because they used an assembler. Not a guarantee, but right, it's like some of the things that I start kind of tucking away into my head as I'm prepping the next steps as I get deeper and deeper into this file. Now, we have no signatures then that say, hey, this was packed by evil packer B. And that's just because there are no signatures for it. So if you go down to the signatures window, you'll see that we have a lot of different, the database, and then a lot of different file types, ELF and PE. We were PE files, so of course the PE signatures are going to be relevant here. And over to the right, I'm going to make this larger here. You'll have essentially the signature itself. Now, at this point, I'm not going to get too deep into the signatures. If you're familiar with older utilities such as PIDE, P-E-I-D, it uses a very similar approach. If you're familiar with things like Yara, again, very similar approach in that we define a series of typically bytes, and we say, hey, these bytes, which are tend to be opcodes or data in the binary itself, these bytes are unique, distinct enough that I think this constitutes a good signature, and therefore we can detect this packer or this obfuscation method. Now, you'll find with these compare EP, usually they have kind of two options. One is to limit the pattern to the entry point. So it uses the entry point that we talked about earlier, goes to that entry point, and looks at the bytes. I think there's a way we could probably do that. Let's go to the hex editor. Maybe. Nope, maybe I can't have two windows open at the same time. Oh, now I lost my window. Oh, goodness. Oh, there it is. Okay, well, anyways, we'll take a look at this when we in the next video when we begin the disassembly. It'll be a little bit easier. But if you went to the entry point in the file and you looked at the first series of bytes, sequence of bytes, that's oftentimes what they're doing. Now, in order to craft these byte values, you're probably looking at the disassembly. You're probably looking at the actual code and saying, okay, I can recognize this pattern and I do indeed think it's unique enough. You start crafting your signatures, you test it against a whole wide variety of different binaries. It's a whole process that I'd like to eventually cover in a video. But suffice it to say, that's what we're looking at. If it's not limited to the entry point, then it will scan the whole entire file or a large portion of it. I don't know 100% how DetectItEasy works, but it's very similar to Yara. You can do the same thing in Yara. You can say, go to the entry point and look just here for this byte pattern, or you can say, hey, look in the whole file. And again, kind of the general idea is that if we limit it to the entry point, we're being more precise. So we're likely increasing the odds of getting a true positive, because the byte pattern might repeat depending on how strong that signature is later in the file. If we scroll down, you'll see that there are just any number of different signatures that are available. There's a little bit of logic inside of these rules, but again, it's going to look and feel very similar to writing Yara. And so if you haven't gotten to the point where you're looking at Yara and writing Yara, more than likely, if you're interested in this content, that's something that you're going to be doing. And if you're not, it's not on your list of things to learn and to do. I would very, very highly recommend it. Okay, we can close the signatures for now. Right? Most folks are going to take the binary, drop it on here, look for these results. Right? There are no results, then it's not a known packer, and we've got to move on to that next stage of analysis. The scanning happens automatically, but you have some different options here: recursive scan, deep scan, heuristic scan. And if you modify that and want to try again, you can always click the scan button. You have options, so go ahead and play around with those a little bit just to alter how the tool works. I find in most cases that I'm happy with sort of the default setup. So I don't go in here too often, but you certainly could especially if you want to modify the style, but it comes with a dark theme, so that's always a win. Now, what about some other samples? Well, we have a .NET sample, and that shows a couple of different options here. So some of the capabilities are going to be dependent upon, of course, the type of file that you're analyzing. This is a .NET file. Let's see, PE64. It doesn't necessarily say that there, but you can see that it has, .NET has well, .NET files use the PE file format. They have a slightly different structure. They have, like, for example, .NET resources, which are different than regular PE file resources. And that might be able to break them out for you here so that you can take a look at that, that content. You'll also notice that this particular file, it says, hey, this is protected by confuser1.x. And so that's really helpful, because now if you're familiar with that as an obfuscator, as a packer, it can help you determine sort of your next steps of analysis. So if you're familiar with it, you might know how to quickly unravel it. You might be like, okay, it's all this convoluted logic, but if I do this, go here, I'll be able to dump the next stage, or maybe you have a tool for it. If you're not familiar, well, then now is a good opportunity to do a little bit of research, to look up how Confuser works, and maybe even more helpful would be to look at other malware analysis reports where someone says, okay, here's my analysis of dealing with the .NET Confuser as an obfuscator or cryptor or packer. It kind of gets lumped under the same name. Here's another example. This one is UPX. UPX is a very well-known packer because it's freely available. You can install it on pretty much any major operating system, and use it to pack. And so it's used not only for by malicious authors, surprisingly to this day, but then it's also used by legitimate software developers because it works well. So here you can see again we have a packer, result, UPX, version number. I forgot to look up what that means off the top of my head, but I think it just has to deal with the compression method. And so if we look at, let's go to the memory map. Or here, no, let's look at Entropy. That'll give us kind of the same view. But you'll see section 2 is UPX2. So this is a really good example of where the section names are a pretty strong indicator that likely this thing was packed with UPX. You'll also see that section 2 is very small and has very, very low entropy, and then section 1 appears to be packed. And so let's see, where is the entry point for this? For 62860, 6.2, so I believe that means it's in this section where it's likely doing the unpacking work before jumping. I can't believe I'm actually kind of forgetting how UPX works. Maybe we'll take a look at that in a future video because it operates relatively straightforward. There are modified and cracked versions of UPX that you'll come across that negate the ability to use UPX as a just sort of out of the box, the versions that you would install, and you might have to manually unpack it. And I think it's just a good, as you're getting into packing and unpacking, it's just a good place to start. It's a good, to start to get the feel for how this works. So maybe we'll talk about that in a future video as well. Okay, so there was just a few examples. This is DetectItEasy. It's a great tool. It tells you a lot about the binaries. For this demo and the demo that I'm going to produce for the next video, what this is telling me, let's go back to our original sample. I don't know what it's packed by. We don't know what it's packed by yet, but it certainly looks like it's packed. If we look at the entropy, you can see sort of a similar pattern as we saw with UPX in that we have a very large section that's packed or highly entropic. We have a small section that is not. That's probably the unpacking code. We can't see important strings like we saw with the config extraction. And so if we're not really sure what to do, then oftentimes the next step, if I'm so inclined, if I have the interest or the desire to take this to the next step, will be to now probably analyze it in something like IDAPRO. Now that's not always the case. You might be able to put it in a sandbox. Sandbox have these they have like for triage here, we have the overview, and then we have the different tabs for the two different VMs that were used for the analysis. And if you scroll down, you might find under downloads that there's these different memory dumps. And sometimes, sorry, here, let's go back to the top. Okay, let's go to the overview. No, that's not it. Sorry, here we go. The signatures. If we no, it must be on a different version than I'm thinking of triage. Well, some of what I'm trying to get at is that some of the sandboxes, this signature applied to something very particular, and oftentimes that signature it can't recognize the packed version because there's so much variation in how they're packed and distributed. So it's the unpacked version that the signature catches on. And some platforms will then take and say, hey, it was this memory dump right here that the signature matched on. So this could be your unpacked executable. And there's a lot of other tools out there too. There's PECIV and some others that allow you to not have to get into the RE aspect of it as deep using tools like IDA, but rather allow the dynamic analysis process to take place and then extract it from there. So we might explore those in other videos, but I want to use this as an opportunity to get a little bit deeper into the RE process and using tools like IDA to better understand how the packing unpacking process works. So that's the route we're going. So I'm not trying to present this as this is the only way I ever do this and I'll always end up going into IDA Pro. Not the case. It all depends on my goals. Let's say we want to create a config extractor. Let's say we want to learn more about unpacking. This is the route I'm usually heading. If I'm in a hurry and I don't care, well, then I might grab a utility like I'd mentioned and go more of a dynamic analysis route and hope that I can just find that unpacked sample in memory. Not everything will unpack cleanly. And again, there's a lot of variation. So not to drag on the conversation for too long, but just to make sure that I'm giving this the proper context that it deserves. Okay, hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop some comments in, and I will we will definitely continue the conversation in the next video. So I hope to see you all then.